So in terms of a background, with respect to the history and governance of the petroleum subsidies in Trinidad and Tobago, it was first imposed in 1974 by the government in the form of the Petroleum Production Levy and Subsidy Act. This levy was imposed at the time because the price of oil increased from $3 to $12. So I know today we will think of $12, that is nothing. But I believe that yesterday the price of the WTI was approximately $8 per barrel. So imagine that quadrupling today and the rampant effects that it could have on the global economy as a whole. So it's not the emphasis in terms of the $3 to $11, but it's on the emphasis on the quadrupling. So what the government of the day then did was impose the act whereby petroleum companies would be taxed 4% of their sales income, and that levy will go towards the fund that is managed by the Ministry of Finance, and that fund will then be used to finance the petroleum subsidies. The petroleum subsidies came in this form. The government set fixed prices for gasoline in the form of premium super and regular, and diesel and kerosene. So they set fixed prices. But then someone still has to put the bill between the international price of oil and the fixed prices. So that fund from the levy is what was basically used to finance that gap, more or less. So as seen in the diagram, figure 1, we see that the petroleum subsidy, the petroleum production levy, that will be the 4% of the sales income, that will then go to the fund which we see on top. And that fund, which is managed by the Ministry of Finance, will then be used to finance the petroleum subsidy. Note well, not all the time the fund will be sufficient to finance the petroleum subsidy. In the case of that, we'll have a subsidy liability. In the event that there's a shortfall, that is where the government will come in and they will have to just pay the excess. Note well, at the time, the main objective of the petroleum production levy was to cushion the burden brought about by the high prices of petroleum products. But at present, it is mainly viewed as a direct means through which the population could share in the nation's natural resource wealth. In terms of the economic impact, petroleum subsidies amounted to over $20 billion between the period 2000 and 2011. And it is mainly driven by oil price shocks and the changes in domestic demand. As known in the Caribbean, Trinidad and Tobago is widely known for its energy wastage. Finally, government would have footed approximately 46.5% of total subsidy payments between the period 2001 and 2011. So remember before I indicated the shortfall at the bottom there, that would have accounted for 46.5% within that period. So this diagram basically illustrates government's contribution towards direct contribution towards the fuel subsidy. That would be the red section over the period 2001 to 2011, whereas the black section would have indicated the total. So, yeah. And I wanted to highlight this diagram, which illustrates the average crude oil price per barrel. And we've seen that it would have consistently increased up to 2008, but then there was the sharp dip in 2009, for which it has been recovering since. The reason why I wanted to emphasize on this diagram is, remember, subsidy is mainly driven by prices, the oil prices, and also domestic demand. So as the price of oil increases, what happens to subsidy? And by the subsidy is the gap between the international price and the domestic price. So as the price of oil increases, subsidy will increase. And at the same time, I wanted to highlight this lovely diagram here, which shows our oil production in Trinidad and Tobago. We see that our oil production has consistently decreased since 2006 to 2013. And that is a trying problem, because remember, the subsidy is financed by the fund, which is under the levy and government. But the fund will be based on the percentage of sales income, and sales income will be based on oil production. So if our oil production is reducing, what will happen to the financing of the subsidy? As a result, government will have to put more and more of the bill. Okay, in terms of a global overview of fossil fuel subsidies, energy consumption if it is continued at its current rate without effective reform attempts or reduction attempts, petroleum subsidies are projected to increase to $660 billion by the years 2015 and 2020, respectively. So we would have seen the trend from 1991 to 2008, and not surprisingly, in 2009 it dipped because the price of oil dipped. And then if it goes at the current rate, 2015 it will increase to 600, and 2020 to 660. I wanted to highlight, I love the diagrams, so I just like to look at trends. So, similar, the trend, the dip in 2009. Similar, the trend, the dip in 2009. Similar, the trend, the dip in 2009 and increase from since then. So the following research questions actually came about, of which I'll be mainly dealing with the first two. First question, what are the distributional effects of petroleum subsidies in Trinidad? Are the effects of petroleum subsidies progressive, neutral, or regressive in nature? What are the prospective, direct, and indirect welfare effects of subsidy reform on households in Trinidad? And are the effects of subsidies and subsidy reform progressive, regressive, or neutral in nature? So, in terms of my literature review, in terms of the comprehensive analysis, I went into the classical schools of thought, the Keynesian schools of thought, the neoclassicals who advocated subsidies, who were against subsidies. But see that we have a limited time span, and just break it down into the arguments for and the arguments against petroleum subsidies. For petroleum subsidies, COTE et al. 2006 indicated that it is a cost-effective way to protect the real incomes of the poor. El Paturi 2012 also highlighted that subsidies expanded the access to energy, protected the poor, foster industrial development, and avoid inflationary pressures. On the other side of the argument, we see that when it comes to petroleum subsidies, it tends to be mainly regressive in nature. In addition, Aragi and Bokadari 2012 indicated that petroleum subsidy reform, if done the right way, could actually have positive effects where welfare is concerned for households. But what is needed is adequate compensation packages for household income groups. So you can't say just going to remove it just so, you have to have an appropriate plan. So continuing my literature review, this diagram just illustrates what will impact the petroleum subsidy reform effects on household income groups. And emphasis was based on the provision of compensation, the size of the subsidy, the type of the subsidy, the structure of the economy. So there are different influential factors that will actually influence the impact of petroleum subsidy reform on household income groups. So the left-hand side indicates the different authors who would have agreed with it, the top indicates the factors, and the text indicates the agreements, more or less. In terms of local research, Bash 2004 did a very good publication in the sense that he dealt with petroleum subsidy reform in terms of actually altering the way in which the subsidy is calculated. He recommended the removal of excise duties, restructuring of the VAT, and restructuring of subsidy financing, of which it is, he looked at how it would have affected inflation and would have affected the transportation index. In terms of my methodology, I intend to use the partial equilibrium model, and I would have followed the following steps: calculation of determine the type of subsidy, the magnitude of the subsidy, the economic effect, which will be done through a first order conditional analysis, and quantify my parameters, and then run a sensitivity analysis to make sure that the overall study is actually reliable. So in terms of my methodology, my population, we mainly focused on households in Trinidad and Tobago that utilize private and or public transportation in the following municipalities, which would be more or less everybody here, right? Yeah? And in terms of my sampling frame, it was derived from the CSO's continuous sample survey of population, and the sampling technique was a stratified cluster sampling based on the independent variables of income and geographic location. In terms of the survey, 500 households were interviewed from August 18th to the 3rd of October, which was just 6 days ago. And we focused on the following areas: Point Fortin, San Fernando, Miami, Rio Claro, San Grande, etc. And we intend to obtain data from secondary data from the Ministry of Energy, CSO, etc. from the data, these were the preliminary results derived. As indicated before, we focus on the effects of petroleum subsidy mainly. So from the data derived, we realized that private transportation accounted for 43%, whereas public transportation only accounted for 34%, and the combination of private and public, 23%. In terms of my petroleum subsidy analysis, I will look at the fuel transportation expenditure and public transportation expenditure. Fuel transportation expenditure in the sense that how much would have been households' expenditure if there wasn't any subsidy? How much would be, that would be the fuel, that would be the reform or the reference transportation expenditure. And then I will look at the actual transportation expenditure, and then deduct the first from the latter, and then you'll get the subsidy transportation expenditure to determine whether or not it is regressive, progressive, or neutral in nature. And same will be done for the public transportation expenditure. So from the results derived, the demand for fuels, also we have the different household income groups. Lower income group will be the darker green, which will be household income groups that earning $0 to $9,000 in income. And then the medium household income groups will be from 9,000 to 17,000, higher up household income groups, 17,000 and above. This is per month. Right? So based on the demand for fuels, we see that for premium, close to 70% of the demand for premium stem from higher household income groups. When it comes to super, 41.45% stem from middle income groups. And when it comes to diesel, close to 50% stem from the higher household income groups. So what we're seeing there is that not only the higher household income groups demanding most of the fuel, but the lower household income groups, they're very low. It's very, very low. And when it comes to the distribution of subsidies for private transportation, we see that the proportion of these subsidies are not that contrasting. 28% versus 36% versus 34%. Is not that contrasting. However, when it is you look at the fuel subsidy per household, that is where you see the contrast. So ideally, a household should get $745 in subsidies per month on average. However, when it is we look at the lower household income group, you see that they're only getting $454. When we look at the middle household income group, they're getting $743 per month. When it is we look at the higher household income group, they're getting $1,610, which is more than twice the amount. So from that, we can see that it's basically regressive in nature. When it came to public transportation, we looked at D1 stands for maxi taxi, D2 taxi, D4 other transportation. When we looked at public transportation, we saw that the middle household income groups tend to dominate the demand for public transportation. And when we looked at the distribution of the subsidies in terms of the public transportation, we see that the lower household income group accounts for 42.5%, the middle 37.1%, and the higher household income groups 20.4%, making ideally each household should earn $204.72 per month. However, we see that the lower household income group only getting $187, the middle household income group only getting $205, which is close to the average, but the higher household income group getting $252.22. So my preliminary conclusions are petroleum subsidies, which facilitate private and public transportation, are regressive in nature. Petroleum subsidy reform is expected to have regressive effects on household income groups, transportation and expenditure. And as a direct means through which the population share in the nation's resource wealth, there is a stringent need for petroleum subsidies to be allocated more equitably. The way forward, as indicated before, I've now received the raw data, so I intend to then conduct my petroleum subsidy reform analysis and then draw my final conclusions and recommendations. Thank you.
My presentation will follow on very nicely from what Marissa just presented there. I'm going to be speaking more or less to the same topic. Looking first of all from a Caribbean perspective as to why we need to examine the whole issue of transfers and subsidies. Looking at it therefore in terms of Trinidad and Tobago, more specifically looking at the economic impact of subsidies in Trinidad and Tobago. And my last few slides will look at the policy recommendations as to how we should actually go about transforming the whole issue of fuel subsidies in Trinidad and Tobago. So let me just give you a quick overview of Caribbean economies as it were. When we look at per capita incomes, Caribbean economies are mainly upper middle income to high income economies. Here I'm showing statistics which look at per capita incomes for all of our countries on purchasing power parity, as it were, for 2011. From this we can see that we're fairly high income countries. Of course, we know the distribution of income suggests that there are still many poor people living within our economies. But let's just compare our per capita incomes as it were. Cayman Islands, fairly good. British Virgin Islands, Trinidad and Tobago is ranking still fairly high there, and then we come down. I include the two last countries at the bottom, which shows you their per capita incomes. Qatar is the #1 ranked country with $146,000 per capita. And Singapore, a country which we tend to always try to compare many of Caribbean economies to, with per capita income there of about $72,000. So this just gives you a flavor as to how Caribbean economies are performing. What has been the growth experience for Caribbean economies? And of course I'm here representing the Caribbean Development Bank, so I look at the borrowing member countries of the CDB. What we have seen is that over the last decade or so, when we compare the growth rates of Caribbean economies, we have not been performing as well as some of our comparators. So for example, on average over the last decade, world growth was on average 3.8% per annum. In emerging and developing economies, the average growth rate there was 6.4%. In SIDS, which includes the Caribbean, but also those in the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Islands, the growth rate there was 4%. While on average, Caribbean economies only expanded on average of about 3% over the last decade. So there's something telling us that there is something structurally wrong within our economies. Why are we not able to keep up with some of our comparators as it were? This chart also shows a similar trend. And here, the black line at the bottom shows how Caribbean countries have performed against some of the other comparators, as it were, in terms of growth rates. Why am I showing this? Because when you look at a fiscal snapshot, as it were, for many of our countries, we find that we are very highly indebted. Our fiscal deficits have been increasing over the last decade and certainly before, which has led to many of our countries having very high and perhaps unsustainable levels of debt. If I look at this in a bit more detail, we can see the overall balance, government's balance as a percentage of GDP, and the primary balance, as it were. And the last column there to the right shows the level of indebtedness for many of our economies. Now I should say that here, Jamaica has been improving recently from having a very, very high debt to GDP ratio in excess of 150% of GDP. That has been coming down. They have recently been in a fund program, and things have been going well there for them. Grenada, very high levels of debt to GDP ratio. They have just entered a fund program, and we expect over the next few years that the debt to GDP ratio should also improve as it were. St. Kitts and Nevis, they have made substantial progress to bring their debt to GDP ratio down from almost 200% of GDP, now down, and I think the latest figures suggest to me that it is well below 100% of GDP now. But the story there is the same. For Trinidad and Tobago at the bottom, we are still doing fairly well in terms of our debt to GDP ratio. This figure is for 2013, but the last figure I've seen, that has increased significantly and is well over 40% of debt to GDP ratio. So there's something there telling us that perhaps our expenditure in Caribbean economies, and certainly within Trinidad and Tobago as well, we're on an unsustainable path, as it were, and we need to start looking at how we can manage this in a more sustainable way. This chart, of course, reflects where Caribbean economies are in terms of public debt as a percentage of GDP, and we have some of the most highly indebted countries here in the Caribbean for all of the world. And here you can see Jamaica ranking fairly high, Grenada there as well. I'm showing you this data because it is quite important in terms of how countries go about financing their fiscal packages, as it were. When countries run a deficit, they must borrow, and sometimes they must borrow in the international market. if the debt to GDP ratio is too high or unsustainable, it means that they tend to get a negative rating in terms of their credit ratings here, and it becomes very important to borrow in international markets. The reason for telling you this is that fiscal prudence and fiscal management is very important for the welfare of the economy. And so we must be cognizant of what governments are actually spending on. And hence the reason why I'm focusing this presentation on transfers and subsidies. What has been the trend in transfers and subsidies for the Caribbean region? Here I've taken some of the smaller islands and put them together. Generally, transfers and subsidies over the last decade or so has been on the rise within the Caribbean. And this is showing it as a percentage of gross domestic product. If I also look at some of the more, I say, advanced territories within the Caribbean, or the bigger, let's say, geographical territories, if you look at the top lines there, you can see that, for example, Barbados and Trinidad and Tobago, transfers and subsidies have increased significantly since 2000. For Trinidad and Tobago, that has increased from about 6% of gross domestic product all the way up to almost 14% of GDP now. A significant increase in transfers and subsidies. I've tried to put this chart here to show you the relationship between transfers and subsidies and central government's overall balance. As transfers and subsidies have increased, so too have central government's overall balances also gone in the wrong direction. So for me, there's a correlation there, as it were. I'm not suggesting causation, but there seems to be a correlation. So let's now focus on Trinidad and Tobago. For Trinidad and Tobago, like I showed earlier, the whole idea of transfers and subsidies have increased significantly from 2000 up until 2013 and hovers around between, I would say, 13 and 14% of GDP now. Why is this so important? Well, it's quite important because you're now spending a significant proportion of your income on transfers and subsidies, while at the same time your natural asset is wasting. Here I've showed from 1970 to 2007 an estimate of the depletion of the country's oil and natural gas reserves, and here I've tried to convert it into dollar values. While we spend significantly on transfers and subsidies, we have found that over the last decade or so, the depletion of our natural resources has increased significantly and is up to around 30% of gross national income. So I'm trying to marry this with the type of economy that we have. We must understand that we must manage the economy in a way which accounts for the depletion of the natural resources. And we spoke a bit about this in the earlier session about how do you contribute to the Heritage and Stabilization Fund. An important factor for that is you must look at your depletion of your natural asset and try to accumulate savings to substitute for that depletion, as it were. For some of you here, students of economics, there's an indicative adjusted net savings rate for Trinidad and Tobago, which suggests that Trinidad and Tobago is also on an unsustainable path. The first column here shows gross savings. If we were to look at this economy from, let's say, traditional economic statistics, we would say that Trinidad and Tobago is performing fairly well. But if I now try to incorporate the depreciation of fixed capital, we find that comes down from about just over 30% of GNI down to around 20%. Maybe the government is also investing in human capital, and so they're spending on educational expenditures, and so that raises the overall asset value of the economy. But if we now account for the depletion of the natural resource, here natural gas as well as oil, we find that we're now going into negative. So what we first had from a positive savings rate of in excess of 30% of gross national income, when we account for the depletion of the natural asset, we find that Trinidad and Tobago is actually now in negative territory. And here I've also tried to include pollution damages, as it were, associated with the production and consumption within the economy. So I must hurry along here now, I just have 5 minutes. Let's look at fuel subsidies in a bit more detail for Trinidad and Tobago. 2 real problems we must be cognizant of with respect to fuel subsidies in this type of economy. First of all, we have an opportunity cost. when the fuel is sold at a price that is less than the world market price, it encourages the over-demand, let's say, of the fuel, and so the overconsumption of the fuel within the local market. It also means that if people are consuming too much of the fuel domestically, it leaves less for us to export, and so there is an opportunity cost associated with us not being able to sell that product on the international market, as it were. I've tried to calculate here an opportunity cost as a percentage of government current revenue. Note that this is in addition to the actual cost of the subsidy. And what I found here is that the opportunity cost is really in the range of around just under 10% of government current revenue. This is what I'm estimating as the opportunity cost for us having the fuel subsidy in place now. There's a second problem, and as Marissa indicated in her presentation, the distribution of fuel subsidies, when you examine it, can tend to be regressive. There are a number of calculations that you can do to look at this, but simply a methodology that I put up here, look at the impact of the fuel subsidies on direct household incomes, and then also try to estimate the indirect impact of fuel subsidies on household incomes. Price shifting model is utilized. I'm just going to flip through these charts because I don't need to go into great detail there. But what is the real income effect of the subsidy as a percentage of total household incomes as a group? Here, I've looked at different household income groups and calculated what is the real income effect of the subsidy. This is looking at the direct and indirect impacts of different household income groups. Here we can see that, for example, on average, all groups, there's a real income effect of just under 7% of total income. As we go up into the higher income groups, that number increases. What's quite important is that at the very low levels of income, those people are receiving far less benefits from the subsidy. And this certainly re-emphasizes what Marissa said in her presentation. If I look at this in terms of monthly income for Trinidad and Tobago, this is what I'm getting. At the highest income group, they are receiving, let's say, just under $1,600 in TT dollars per month in benefits from the subsidy. While, for example, the lowest income group there is receiving about just over $100 as it were. So it suggests to us that the fuel subsidy is highly regressive as it were. So, conclusion and policy recommendations, we need to look at the large opportunity costs associated with subsidies in a real way, because there are these opportunity costs which we are not accounting for. Yes, the subsidy costs government something directly, but it also costs us indirectly because we're not exporting this processed fuel on the international market and receiving those revenues. There's a regressive distribution of subsidies as shown over here. This means that there can be allocated inefficiencies within the market, and this can, of course, possibly impact real competitiveness, as it were. Why am I saying that? Because too often, and the earlier presentation by Dr. Hossein suggests that the real effective exchange rate is actually going against many of our manufacturers, against some of our exporters, but we're still able to export significantly to the Caribbean region. And I think one of the main reasons for us being able to do that is because of the huge energy subsidy that we receive here. And it means that many firms are not concentrating their efforts enough on where they can be, let's say, in improving productivity and competitiveness in other aspects of their production chain, as it were. So the need for reform, that is clear. But the reform needs to be phased, and there needs to be, and I guess we can discuss this during the question and answer session. I say that if the government was to reduce the fuel subsidy, there could be an opportunity cost on overall subsidy, possibly of about TT $6 to $8 billion in savings per annum. And this, of course, can lead to increased tax revenues for the government. It's quite important because the use of fuel can be considered to be inelastic. And it's actually a good way for government to raise revenue if you were to actually tax that instead of providing a subsidy. The reintroduction of compressed natural gas could be one way of how you could certainly remove the subsidy without having significant impacts. new technology, I remember it was introduced in the 1990s, meant that it became unreliable, but the technology has moved on significantly now, so that it becomes much more reliable and faster for you to refuel your vehicle using compressed natural gas. And we must think about an efficient and reliable public transport. This is certainly needed. And Dr. Hossein spoke about the rapid rail, but I'm just saying mass transit. I'm not being here. Also, we must think about energy efficiency and renewable energy as also possible alternatives. We need to start inculcating that within the society. How to become more energy efficient. We live in a region where we are blessed with sunshine, but yet in Trinidad and Tobago we're not using those resources sufficiently. The use of solar energy, let's say. And that is primarily down to the fuel subsidy that we all enjoy in this country. And finally, untargeted subsidies are inefficient. If we remove the subsidy, I do understand that there are some groups in society that would be negatively affected. But we can use some of the savings, including the opportunity costs, let's say $1 or $2 billion per annum, and target those transfers to the individuals who require it, as it were, rather than a blanket subsidy, which is affecting and certainly benefiting the wealthier persons in society more than the lower income groups, as it were. Okay. Thank you.